In a recent interview, Piers Morgan interviewed Andrew Tate, and among the topics they discussed was the pandemic response. Tate makes the case that it was a disaster, while Morgan attempts to defend it. Their discussion highlights how the official narrative around the pandemic response continues to crumble and how the establishment is trying to maintain it while defending their actions.
Why would they sit there and say, we've put together this massive psyop, we're going to convince everybody to inject themselves with poison, and we're going to lock everyone in their houses, and it's all a lie, and we're going to let this one guy who everyone listens to.
Andrew, it wasn't all a lie.
Yes, it was.
It wasn't. There was a new novel coronavirus. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what the facts were, and you can then laugh at them if you wish.
Sure.
But there was a novel coronavirus, COVID-19. It was killing thousands of people a day.
Really?
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
Scary.
Yeah, and I know people who died.
Who doesn't? I know people who died before Corona.
Fine, I'm sure people died of lots of things, but it was killing exponentially thousands and thousands of people, and then vaccines were developed at very high speed, and they managed to save, in my estimation, millions of lives. You may not agree with that,
absolutely,
but those are facts as assumed by the body of scientific and medical experts in the world.
Here, Morgan perfectly recites the establishment line that members of the COVID regime likely tell themselves so they can sleep at night. Unfortunately, although it is comforting, it is also wrong. The earliest data that was coming in from such sources as the Diamond Princess cruise ship clearly showed that COVID essentially behaved as a bad flu, potentially dangerous to the elderly and infirm, but that's it. Even Bill Gates now admits this.
And then at that point, we didn't really understand the fatality rate. We didn't understand that it's a fairly low fatality rate and that it's a disease mainly of the elderly, kind of like flu is, although a bit different than that.
Morgan then states that vaccines were developed at extremely high speeds, and these saved the day. He's correct in that they were developed extremely fast, but only because Big Pharma was allowed to bypass the normal safety protocols previously used for vaccine development. Vaccines, in particular the mRNA vaccines, were never considered as a viable option to end a pandemic, as they could not be developed fast enough if all safety protocols were used. Even Fauci admitted it would take 10 years to develop a safe vaccine, and that's only if everything went perfectly.
To make the transition from getting out of the tried and true egg growing, which we know gives us results that can be, beneficial. I mean, we've done well with that, to something that has to be much better. You have to prove that this works, and then you've got to go through all of the clinical trials, phase 1s, phase 2s, phase 3, and then show that this particular product is going to be good over a period of years. That alone, if it works perfectly, is going to take a decade.
Further, the Pfizer trials did not show that they reduced the risk of death. In the trials, 15 people who got the vaccine died versus 14 who got the placebo. Morgan is simply spinning a COVID regime fantasy here.
The body of scientific and medical experts, you mean the Matrix. I could get...
What is the Matrix?
The Matrix...
I'm not surprised that Morgan doesn't understand what the Matrix is, as he is a part of it. In terms of COVID, the Matrix took on the form of the COVID regime, an unholy alliance of big pharma, big tech, corporate media, the intelligence agencies, and public health. It was this authoritarian hydra that forced the West to abandon civil rights and sound public health for China's model of Hong Kong. These included such previously discredited nonsense as lockdowns, masking, and social distancing. The reason Morgan can't see it is that he was a cog in this wretched machine. He can't understand the Matrix for the same reason a fish can't comprehend water. It is simply the milieu in which he swims.
The Matrix are a bunch of people who can come up with studies from the sky to say anything they want them to say, so they can use the MSM to purport garbage inside of people's minds. So you end up locked in your house, clapping for the NHS like a performing seal, injecting yourself with experimental poison for the 9th time. It's a lie. There was no reason to lock everyone in their house. More people died from missed cancer appointments than anyone ever died of COVID. People always got the sniffles before COVID, and they've always got it since. Let me ask you a question.
Hang on,
sir.
it wasn't.
Where is COVID gone?
It wasn't.
Diseases don't go away.
It wasn't.
Where's COVID gone?
It wasn't. Well, the COVID strains have got milder, as indeed flu did. Flu used to
so
kill.
It's gone away.
Well, flu pandemic in about 100 years ago killed 50 to 100 million people, and it's got steadily milder over the decades since. This is normal medical science pathway for most pandemics, right? So on that,
Here, Morgan accidentally stumbles over some truth, although he is unaware of it. All pandemics will burn out over time. The key is to follow the science, and that means protecting the vulnerable while allowing the rest of society to function as normally as possible. As D.A. Henderson, considered a god in epidemiological circles for his role in eradicating smallpox, put it, experience has shown that communities faced with epidemics or other adverse events respond best and with the least anxiety when the normal social functioning of the community is least disrupted. This science-based approach is what got the West through the 1957 Asian flu and the 1968-69 Hong Kong flu. What was unique about COVID was not the virus, but the fact that our entire Western leadership class abandoned this scientific approach for China's. This is the kind of questions journalists like Morgan should have been asking, but never did. Of course, it's hard to question the machine when you're part of it.
I mean, your sort of cast iron, it was all matrix MSM nonsense, is palpably untrue.
Well, I'll tell you why that's not untrue. Let me tell you my personal experience with COVID. I'm an extremely logical person. At the beginning, when everyone was dying, dropping dead in the streets in China, which I never saw, by the way, funny, and the Italian hospitals were full, English hospitals were never full, funny. Me and my brother sat there and said, if this disease is so deadly and can damage us as strong military-age males, then the world is over. So there's no point in hiding in our house. We decided to go to Sweden. On day one of COVID, day one when everyone still believed, we went to Sweden. Why does no one talk about the fact that Sweden was open the entire time? Why does no one talk about the fact they didn't have masks or lockdown or vaccines? My brother and I partied in nightclubs 7 days a week for 3 entire months while everyone in England was locked in their house.
Sweden actually had a number of restrictions.
Not when I was there. It was open.
Not as draconian as we had in the UK, and there are certainly legitimate questions to ask about the scale of our lockdowns. I think people panicked. They saw what was happening in Italy, which had the second best medical healthcare system in the world, and people were dying in massive numbers and the hospitals were overrun. So people may have panicked.
Did you hear about
What Morgan is saying here is simply not true. What happened is that Italian leaders allowed themselves to be led by China, who tricked them into becoming the first Western country to impose lockdowns. Yet by March 9th, and despite mass testing, Italy had only 9,000 COVID cases and had recorded 500 deaths. Although tragic, these deaths were all of the elderly and did not hold a candle to the winter flu pandemics Italy experienced in 2014 and 2016, when over 40,000 Italians passed away. Mathematically, those pandemics were 80 times worse than COVID. Italy was hit with a pandemic of fear and authoritarian power, not disease, and had journalists like Morgan been on the ball, they would have pointed that out.
Did you hear about the guy who died in a motorcycle crash and it was a COVID death? Did you hear about that one?
Well, there was certain
Downing Street didn't seem very concerned with
there
COVID.
was a long debate about people dying of COVID or with COVID. I know all that, but the bottom line for me, it is indisputable that COVID was a deadly pandemic that killed a lot of people. It turned out a lot of older people more than young people, but they didn't know that at the time, not for a long period. The vaccine saved millions of people's lives. There are legitimate questions about some of the boosters, about some of the side effects of the vaccines, as there are, by the way, with all vaccines. But the idea that COVID is some invention by the Matrix to suppress and control its people is for the birds, Andrew.
Here, Morgan again repeats his false narratives. He has to keep repeating them as admitting the reality that he was at best duped or worse behaved like a useful idiot is too much for his ego to bear. That is why he has to say that it is beyond dispute. When he repeats this assertion, he's not trying to convince the listener, but rather himself.
It's for the birds.
It seems the birds and
I
I are
don't
friends.
think a smart guy like you actually believes that.
Of course I
And that's one of my
absolutely
problems.
believe that.
One of my problems I have with you is that I think you are intelligent, but I think you also adopt positions that you know are going to get the anti-matrix mob inflamed. And it's just these all-encompassing views you have. COVID was a load of nonsense. Vaccines are all dangerous and killing more people than they say.
Never said that. I said the COVID vaccine.
Well, COVID vaccine, well, you don't think they worked?
No, of course not, because the idea of
Of course
a vaccine,
they worked.
The word vaccine in and of itself is that you
They
get...
saved millions of lives.
If you get a vaccine, you do not get the disease. They changed the definition of vaccine in the dictionary so they could continue to inject us with this pointless poison. I had the vaccine for polio. I've never had polio. You got the vaccine for COVID, and you're bragging online how you have COVID for the 8th time, but it's not that bad because you've had 6 injections. It's insane. And please understand my position. Please understand that I'm a person who doesn't believe any of these studies, don't believe any of this garbage, don't believe the Matrix. I'm a person who was in Sweden for 3 months as everyone was afraid, locked in their houses, partying at will. It was perfectly fine. They had a lower death rate than the UK.
They had a much higher death rate than their neighbouring countries in Scandinavia. Did you know that?
They had a lower death rate than the UK.
Did you know that?
It doesn't, no, I didn't know that.
It doesn't matter to you?
Of course not.
So you wouldn't compare them to their immediate neighbours. You'd only compare them to a country in the UK.
Once again, Morgan is flat out wrong. What Sweden did was follow the real science while ignoring the totalitarian advice of China. As this graph shows from my book, The Little Book of COVID Red Pills, a book Morgan would benefit from reading, Sweden actually had the lowest cumulative excess deaths, including its neighbours. What Morgan is referring to are COVID deaths, but that is not a useful figure. For one thing, how countries counted COVID deaths varied widely. For another, true public health must be a holistic endeavour. If imposing lockdowns saves 1 life from COVID but costs 10 lives from deaths of despair, drug and alcohol abuse, depression, missed cancer screenings, etc., it's not worth it. By adopting a holistic approach, Sweden followed the science and got it right. The Western COVID regime, of which Morgan belonged, got it wrong.
Okay.
If you think lockdowns worked, Piers, if you think lockdowns...
I think lockdowns were only acceptable as an immediate panic move, which it was, before there were vaccines. The moment they had a successful vaccine program that worked, then there was no justification for further lockdowns.
You're a very important person, and you're very well respected.
I'm not important, I'm a journalist.
No, you're very important, and you're very well respected within the UK, and you've been famous for a very long time. Were you invited to the party at Downing Street, or were you not in that circle?
No.
No? Oh, that's a shame.
And I thought the behaviour...
Because they seemed very concerned about COVID on the TV,
and by the way,
they didn't seem to give a shit as soon as the TV was on.
I thought that was disgraceful. And I thought Boris Johnson and the people working at Number 10 who were having those parties, when I had friends of mine who were literally saying goodbye to their mothers on FaceTime on their phone because they weren't allowed in to see them. I knew people in care homes where it ripped through and killed a third of the people in the home in 2 weeks. And the desperation that people felt. I had a cousin who lost his father who couldn't go and see his dying wife and so on. It's
disgusting.
There were terrible stories.
It's criminal.
Terrible stories.
It's disgusting. So let me ask you a question as a professional, because we're both adults and we're both very smart. As a professional, which is more likely, that the government believed COVID was deadly and everybody should be truthfully afraid and locked in their houses, but because they had this spirit inside of them and they couldn't resist the idea of a party, decided to risk their lives to party, or they lied on the television trying to scare everyone and enslave them and lock them in their houses, knowing it's garbage, knowing it's a lie, and not caring, and had a party behind everyone's backs and didn't think they'd get caught? Which one is more likely as a professional, as a logical human?
Why don't we just agree that they were a bunch of rank hypocrites, stupid people, who were behaving utterly selfishly, to the extent that the Queen, when her husband, Prince Philip, dies, is in the church on her own, in a mass, with none of her family around her after losing a rock of 70 years. And it turned out the night before, Downing Street had, I think, 2 parties, including a karaoke party. I think that was shameful and disgraceful.
Well,
so we can agree on that, right?
We can agree on.
Morgan's rationalizations here is telling. Tate makes the excellent point that those in power obviously didn't feel the pandemic was nearly as dangerous as they were promoting. Who would risk death to go to a party? If this is true, then all of the anti-science, anti-civil rights actions taken were unnecessary. It was all totalitarian pain for no health gain. The people Morgan mentions who were forced to watch their loved ones pass on Zoom calls were victims of the insane Fang Kong policies he advocated for. The painful cognitive dissonance of this reality is one that Morgan can't accept, so he attempts to take the high road by calling them hypocrites. The outrage was not the hypocrisy our leaders demonstrated, but the useless and cruel policies they implemented.
We can agree on that, and we can wake up and start to realize, oh, maybe the government doesn't care about us. Maybe the government lies to us. Maybe they tell us things and try and scare us, but they don't actually care themselves. Maybe all they are is hypocritical, self-interested people.
Maybe they are.
Maybe they use the MSM to purport their lies, to keep everybody enslaved while they do whatever they want, and that is the matrix in and of itself. And if you speak against it and people listen to you, I'll repeat this. Your ability to speak freely is directly correlated to your insignificance. If you're as big as I was, the most Googled man on the planet telling the truth, you will pay the price, Piers. And that is why I was locked in that cell. And I do not regret it, because I live true to God. I'm not going to sit here as a coward and not tell the truth to people for as long as I live until they put a bullet in my head. All the things I'm saying and the things I've said are basically the way the entire world thought only 10 years ago. You may buy into the PSYOP, and you may buy into the new thing.
I don't buy into any psyops.
We just talked about the vaccine, sir.
Yeah, the vaccines weren't psyops.
Of course not. No.
Tate is again correct here. As outlined in Laura Dodsworth's excellent book, State of Fear, Western governments the world over unethically use nudge units to get people to comply with their edicts. This obviously irritates Morgan, as I suspect on a subconscious level he knows this is true, but he can't bring himself to admit he was a part of it.
No. So I believe that there should be a man of the house.
You had a polio vaccine, right?
Correct.
Why?
Because I didn't get polio. I wouldn't have a COVID vaccine because I'd still get COVID. Plus probably myocarditis and have a heart attack. So we believe there was a man of the house 10 years ago.
Do you think statistically more people got myocarditis by having the vaccine or not having it?
I think statistically we need to bring it back.
You don't know, do you?
Why would I know? Why would I look at the statistics
Why would you bother
that come from the matrix itself?
So the matrix, so every fact you don't like, because it doesn't suit your agenda, you just dismiss as matrix bullshit.
No, I'll give you a very simple way I view the world. COVID can't hurt me, so why would I take their injection?
You don't have to.
Point two.
You don't have to
They
take
tried
it.
to make us, including you.
Yeah.
You told people they
You know
should
why?
have the vaccine.
You know why?
And if they don't have it, they shouldn't leave their house.
You know why? Because at the time, the scientists, and by the way, scientists is ever evolving. At the time I said that, the scientists said if you had the vaccine, it would prevent you transmitting the virus.
The Matrix
that turned out to be wrong,
because the Matrix
and they
lied.
issued updated advice saying further studies said that actually you could transmit it. And at that point, you know what I did, which you never do? I held my hands up and went, I was wrong because the advice changed, and now I would not say the same thing. That is called actually evolving opinions when facts change. That's actually how a civilized democracy works.
Oh, is it? We live in a civilized...
Once again, Morgan attempts to rationalize the system of medical apartheid that vaccine mandates represented while trying to claim that no one was forced to take the vaccine. He makes the claims that COVID regime scientists, who had gotten everything wrong up to this point, made the claim that the vaccine stopped transmission. Even if this were true, why does this matter if you've taken the jab? But of course, even this wasn't true, as Pfizer executives would later admit the jab was never tested for transmission. If Morgan had been doing his job of speaking truth to power instead of being a mouthpiece for the regime and big pharma, he would have known this too.
We live in a civilized democracy, do we, sir? I actually would argue that point with you for a very long time. I don't think we live in a civilized democracy. Another point I want to make here, if I had cancer or if I was at threat of a genuine disease which could actually harm me, would the NHS text me 10 times a day trying to get me treatment, or would I be sitting there waiting for 8 months to even get an appointment? They wouldn't care about me and they'd let me die. So the fact that they will endlessly text me and try and beg me to get this poison should have been an alarm bell for anybody with a brain.
Actually, I tell you what the NHS sent me. I'm a 58-year-old man. In the last few months, they've sent me one about a flu jab, which I'm going to have, because I think it stops you getting flu, and flu's nasty. A COVID booster, which I won't have. I think I've had enough of those. I'm fine with that, thanks.
Piers admitting that he's not going to get the booster shot is an amazing admission. The scientists who mandated the initial jab are now promoting the latest booster. Does Morgan no longer believe in them? If so, why? Is he doing his own research? Is he thinking? Is he doing what he condemned his fellow citizens for in the harshest ways when the initial vaccines were rolled out?
Thanks. They sent me one about having a check for bowel cancer, which I've done and came back negative, and so on and so on. The NHS texting system is for our benefit. You don't have to do it. No one's holding a gun to your head. The Matrix isn't saying, if you don't have this, Andrew Tate, we're gonna do something to you.
Do you have any idea?
You've not been treated in Romania by their system because of anything to do with COVID vaccines. And your attempt to try and persuade people that that's the case is ridiculous. And you know it's ridiculous.
Do you have any idea how difficult it was to remain unvaccinated, Piers? Let me tell you from somebody who was unvaccinated and traveled the world. Do you have any idea how difficult that was actually to do?
Yes, because countries have border controls.
Oh, because they tried to force everybody. So to sit and say they weren't trying to force, you know what they did? They said, come get the COVID vaccine. It's good for you. It's going to help. They tried to coerce you by being nice. They tried to lover boy everybody. They tried to use the lover boy method to force people to get the COVID vaccine. It just came to, we need to put all these people in jail. They were being nice to people, trying to help them. Unbelievable.
Nobody forced you to have it. Did you have it?
The level of cognitive dissonance Morgan is showing here is astonishing. Nobody forced you. Under vaccine mandates, people lost their jobs, couldn't go to a restaurant, couldn't go to a gym, couldn't travel. Essentially, the unvaccinated were barred from everything in society that makes life worth living. And why? For exercising the discretion that Piers Morgan now using in declining a booster shot. As Thomas Sowell has said, you should never underestimate people's ability to rationalize.
Did you have the vaccine?
Absolutely and utterly not, sir. My principles are not for sale. I would have stayed in my house to the end of human time and sat there as a pureblood, the last one, the last pureblood on the planet before I inject myself with poison.
You're not making an MGM trailer.
Yes, I am, because it's a matter of principle. I am not a farm animal. My blood is mine. It does not belong to the government, and I decide what is in it.
Right. All right, so you have a polio vaccine, but not
Correct,
a COVID one.
correct.
So your brilliant brain has determined that you know more about the medicinal and scientific benefits of individual vaccines. And the polio one, you decided with your brilliant brain, we'll have that. But even though a lot of people, by the way, have had side effects to polio vaccines, did you know that?
Yes, correct.
Is that the Matrix doing that?
No, I didn't say the Matrix gave them the side effect.
Oh.
I've just told you all the reasons I didn't get the vaccine.
Right.
You've already described it at length.
But you work out with your brilliant mind which vaccines to have?
Correct.
Okay.
Piers Morgan is obviously feeling very defensive here as he tries to denigrate Tate with his brilliant brain insult. There is all the difference in the world between the poorly tested and novel mRNA vaccines and the polio vaccine. But further, Piers Morgan admitted earlier that he will not be getting the booster shot. In effect, he is using his brilliant brain to go against the recommendations of health authorities, just like Tate did. Cognitive dissonance can make hypocrites of us all.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay. You realise
You
that
can join my email list on cobratate.com. You can sign up for free, and I'll tell you which vaccines you should
I wouldn't
have.
come to you for vaccine advice.
Why?
Andrew? Because you have zero experience.
I didn't get the
offer me
COVID
any
one.
advice.
I obviously did pretty good. I avoided the poison shot while everyone else got it, so I'm actually pretty proud with my track record.
What happened?
In the end, Piers Morgan is attempting to defend the indefensible and, not surprisingly, fails. Western leaders around the world were duped by Chinese propaganda to implement totalitarian policies under the guise of public health. In China, this is known as Fangkong. If you would like to learn more so that you are not as ignorant as Piers Morgan, get my free ebook at redpillcovid.com today. If Western liberty is to be preserved, the abuses of the COVID regime must be brought to light. We must never follow China's example again. China is Big Brother brought to life and should not be followed.